In Romans 6:17, Paul is commending the Romans to the obedience of the gospel, and he says towards the end, having become obedient from the heart to that pattern of doctrine. And he's talking about their obedience to the gospel. And God indeed does lay out a pattern for how we are supposed to serve him, how we are supposed to glorify him. And it's not just the idea of, the Spirit nudges me in this way, so I feel this way. But, if you want to worship God in this way, I'll worship God in this way, and we can all be right. There's a pattern. And I believe when Paul's talking about that pattern, you can go back to the book of Exodus and read about the pattern for the tabernacle. And God was very, very specific in how he wanted the tabernacle to be constructed. Now, what you'll find many people who claim to be Christians saying today is that, well, that was the Old Testament. God doesn't operate in that way anymore. It's all free grace. We're kind of just free to do what we want. Well, I think that's flawed thinking, because it's still the same God. The same God that gave the instructions for the tabernacle, the same God that gave the instructions for Noah's Ark, the same God that gave the instructions for the temple is the same God who gave the instructions for obedience to the gospel. The Bible does not say that Jesus just purchased a group of people so we could just go around doing our own thing, serving God haphazardly and deciding, hey, if I don't want to join a church, I won't. He purchased us so that we would be a people zealous for good works. And those good works are the ones that God gives us to do in his word, obeying that pattern of doctrine. And this idea of there being a specific objective pattern for obeying God is all throughout the New Testament. Jesus says in Matthew 7:21-23, that only those who do the will of the Father who is in heaven will enter into heaven. And God reveals his will through his word. And we can only enter into heaven if we obey the will of the Father. Now, there's another thing I got to thinking about with this passage, and I want to be very clear that Paul, in the context of which he writes this passage, he in no way has any of the philosophies that are popular in our culture today. But there is one that I think it needs to be talked about, and that's the philosophy or if you want to call it a doctrine of postmodernism. And that is that ideology floods our school systems. It floods the universities. It floods mainstream thinking. And postmodernism, one of the facets of it is there's no such thing as objective truth. There's no such thing as objective reality. It simply doesn't exist. And the postmoderns kind of came up with this after the pre-moderns. They were the people who their worldview was rooted in faith and belief in God and angels and heaven and hell. Then you have the modernists who come along and say that the only way we can know things is through reason, through intellect, through rational thinking, through logical thinking. So reason, logic, common sense kind of deal. And then the postmoderns come along and basically choose the worst of those two. So the pre-moderns say we can know things, but we must start with God. The modernist says that we don't need a God or a religious figure. We can just know things through our own reason, which isn't good, because that completely gets you away from God. You can reason through the scriptures and you can understand the scriptures, but just going along on reason and thinking you're going to have the understanding of life and God is not plausible. But then you have postmodernism that takes the worst from these two and says, you know what, you can't know anything. In fact, So much so that saying that you know something or saying that you're researching something is bigoted, and it is just like it's bad. And to say that you know something and to say that you're researching a topic is somehow a bad thing. I just wonder what some of the Bible writers would think about our postmodern society today. The idea that people are saying there's no such thing as objective reality. I literally can just be what I want to be. I can identify as whatever I want to identify as. And I'm convinced the postmodern kind of ideology seeps into the church. And that's why you have people saying that we can't understand the word of God alike. You have